So welcome everyone. I'm Crystal Collins-Judd, the president of Sarah Lawrence College, and I am especially excited to welcome you to this conversation this evening on, as we all realize, as we near the end of October, the days that get busier and busier and busier with more and more and more things scheduled. So I really appreciate your joining with us this evening. And you are in for a treat. I can guarantee you that, because we have two powerful women in conversation today who I am excited to hear engage each other on the subject of belonging. And we are very much pleased to welcome our friend and colleague from NYU, Dr. Lisa Coleman, who, in addition to her role as the Chief Diversity Officer, serves as NYU's inaugural Senior Vice President for Global Inclusion and Strategic Innovation. And a role she works with senior leaders, internal stakeholders, external partners, constituents to advance, promote, and build capacity for strategic global inclusion, diversity, equity, belonging, and innovation across all of NYU's global network. Prior to her role at NYU, Lisa was Harvard University's first Chief Diversity Officer, but Lisa also knows our liberal arts college world well. She's a graduate of Denison University, where she also serves on the board. I really have appreciated getting to know Lisa, and I am so pleased that Lisa is joining us to help introduce Ifeoma Nwankwo formally to the Sarah Lawrence community. Ifeoma joined us at the end of August as our Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. She likes to describe herself as a teacher, servant, leader, scholar. And in the short time she has been with us, I have gotten to know and appreciate her on all of those dimensions. She comes to us from Vanderbilt University, where she was an associate professor in the Department of English, but also, and critically in the kind of work she does, a faculty affiliate with the Center for Medicine, Health, and Society, the Program in Latinx Studies, and the Center for Latin American Studies. Her significant administrative experience at Vanderbilt included serving as director of the Program in American Studies and an associate provost for strategic initiatives and partnerships. And we could go on and on about these bios, but I'm standing between you and two exciting speakers. So I'm going to stop with that, just a little bit of what both have done. They're going to join, Lisa and Ifeoma are going to join in a conversation for about half an hour to 45 minutes on this topic of belonging and diversity, equity, and inclusion, and where all of those things intersect. And then Amato Sandoval, who is our Dean for Engagement, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, will serve as a moderator of your questions and that conversation. So thank you all for being with us. Welcome, Lisa, to Sarah Lawrence. Welcome, Ifeoma, to meeting this community, and thank you both for this conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Crystal. Thank you, Leslie. And thank you, Amada. Thank you, Sarah Lawrence community. I am honored and thrilled to be here, and especially thrilled to welcome Lisa Coleman. We have some histories in common in which we discovered in terms of our disciplinary training and how we got here. So I'm excited to talk with her about this topic. So welcome. So my first question is, what comes to mind when you hear or see the word belonging?
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. First of all, let me just say thank you, as you did, to the entire team, and getting to know everyone at Sarah Lawrence has been a real treat and delight for me as well. So I'm very excited for this conversation, and congratulations to you on your role. I know getting to know an institution can be super fun too in this transition time. So let me just say that. So when I think about belonging, right, I think there are ways that there's the sort of way in which people understand the word in terms of the familial context, right? And belonging in a family and belonging in that way. And then I also think about it in terms of the ways in which we think about family again, because the thing about family is sometimes family doesn't get along, right? Sometimes I mean, I'd like to say that all families get along, but it's kind of not like that. And also families don't get along all the time. Right. So we might get along at Christmas, but by next Thanksgiving, we might have some challenges. Right. And so when I think about belonging, I think about the idea that you can have challenges and you can still be part of the family. And I think that is key. And I know that, I wrote a little article about this. And so my catchphrase, and we can come back to this, my catchphrase is belonging is debate and dissension without obliteration or annihilation, right? So I'll say that again. It's dissent or debate, right? Without annihilation or obliteration. And so it's that process of coming together, and we can talk more about that.
That makes sense, and we'll definitely talk more about that. For me, it depends on the context, really. So it makes me think of literature, music, law, and life, and the ways in which belonging is helped forward or prevented. The ways in which someone like Toni Morrison, Edwidge Danticat tries to talk about the ways in which law allows or disallows belonging. So for example, it makes me think of Edwidge Danticat talking about the 1937 massacre on the border of Haiti and the Dominican Republic, where the issue is, how do you say the word parsley?
Yes.
Right. And your ability to belong legally is determined by how you speak. So the thing that strikes me about the term belonging is how it changes by context.
I really like that. And, one of the people who's been the most influential in my life is Lani Guinier, right? And Lani Guinier writes a lot about, and the concept of citizen, right? And how one gets counted or not as a citizen. And to go back to what you were saying, right, this extension of rights or the limiting of rights. And I don't mean just limit literal rights. So I don't mean like rights, do I have the right to vote? I mean, things like that, but the right to fully participate in certain activities, to not be judged as through stereotypes or particular kinds of characteristics. And so some of that is about then how citizenry is counted and or muted, right? And so that we can be citizens, but are we full citizens? Or are we 3/4 or 3/8 or et cetera? And so I really like what you're talking about in terms of that notion of belonging is about then how do we move to, right, really engaged spaces as opposed to those muted spaces.
I also think about the imagination and the role of the imagination in belonging. So you mentioned 3/5 of a person. The fact that when Black people were designated 3/5, well, Black men were designated 3/5 of a man, and therefore Black women even less, that people still had the imagination to imagine a future, that a future is possible, that a different future is possible. So in order for belonging to happen and continue, it depends on the human's ability to imagine a future.
One of my favorite groups actually to work with is Disney Imagineering, and that's the research and development and of sort of the Disney empire, I guess. And part of it is because that's exactly right. It's about imagination. How can we imagine things differently than they were before? Well, James Baldwin, one of my favorite authors is James Baldwin, and one of his quotes is, "You, right? You need not take the world as it was when you came in. You can just change it, right? But change is about imagination. It's about the dream. It's about having a dream, right? Maya Angelou says that. So we have to keep those dreams alive for individuals to even be able to imagine possibilities. And I'll also say this. This is the other thing I like to say about belonging. Is one of the reasons I stay in higher education is because I actually do like working with emerging generations, right? I actually like that. So all the challenges in the workforce when people are like, oh my gosh, these millennials, by the way, millennials are 40, they're having children, grandchildren, right? Or Generation X and then the emerging generations. Okay. And so when I think about belonging, I also think about how we frame something often leads to that idea of who can be counted as citizen and then who will belong. And so sometimes when I hear people talking about emerging generations, I'll hear this, they'll say, those millennials, the millennial problem, the Gen Z problem, the alpha problem. And what do you get when you frame something as a problem? A problem. What do you get when you frame something as an asset? An asset. So instead of calling the millennials my problem, I've kind of brought them in to co-create some things, or Gen Z, et cetera. And so I think if we're going to talk about belonging, we also have to talk about co-creation. And someone who's old like me, super old, by the way, this hair is white, okay, white. And so, you know, good salon. And so I think about emerging generations a lot, and a lot of that means that there are things I just don't know, right? There are things I literally just don't know. I heard Crystal trying to post on Instagram earlier, and I was listening and I was thinking, I don't know what she's talking about because I'm not going to post on Instagram, and my niece isn't here, so I'm not going to do that, right? And so this conversation on my end won't be posted on Instagram. I'm sorry, because I actually don't know how to do it. And so, but I think about that, like in belonging, like if we're going to belong, and as societies emerge, then we have to belong together. And that's about co-creation and co-engagement, and whether that's 8 generations in the workforce as we have in higher education, yes, or 5 or 6 in other industries.
Yes, yes. This is the thing that, you know, belonging and diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. I always say that it's an epistemic issue, right? So in order to recognize that someone else belongs, you need to recognize their way of knowing, the knowledge that they have, the knowledge that they bring. And therefore we bring all our knowledges to the table, and exactly, they're all valued. And that's how we innovate. And to me, that's what DEIB potentially brings, right, to the world and to institutions like Sarah Lawrence.
Well, and that's what we learned from science, right? The best of science is you're in those labs and you're actually hashing it out. You're working it out. Sometimes in experiments, things fail, right? Sometimes experiments fail and you have to try again and start again. And so to your point, right, we have to engage that debate, that dissension, and the mistakes, right? I work in a campus where we have a campus in Abu Dhabi, which was sort of alluded to earlier. And in Abu Dhabi, they have these ministries. And I love the idea of a ministry, right? So they have something like the Ministry of Possibility. All right, you know this. So what I say is I would like to create a ministry of mistakes and resiliency and recovery, so that we know we're going to make mistakes, but how do we recover and how are we resilient? And that to me is super interesting, right? That's super interesting in creating places of belonging, because then we know we're going to make mistakes in our families, in our labs, wherever it is. And then how do we recover? How are we resilient? And how do we co-create in that process? And so I think a lot about these ministries, you know, and to your point, I love the idea of Ministry of Possibility because it's about innovation. And we know we can't have innovation without, right, diverse minds, but those diverse minds have to be free to participate, right? They have to be free to bring that citizen to the process, to your points. And if they're not, then we won't see that the benefits of innovation. We might just see dissension.
And the freeing has to happen on both sides, right? So it's us freeing ourselves, and then structures and, you know, other entities freeing us. So there's the legal dimension of it, but there's also us being willing to be introspective and ask questions. What are the ways in which I am not allowing things to move forward? What are the ways in which I have put myself in a box? You know, as I'm standing here pointing at other people, what are the ways in which I'm not allowing other people to be flexible and to be free to think outside of the box? So it's the freeing is on both sides.
That's exactly right. And that self-reflexivity that you're talking about is so important. And I would add to what you said is that we need to know our triggers. Like we also need to know those things that get under our skin, because that often is the thing that, to your point, prevents us from letting things move forward, right? I know, so I'll give an example. When I was younger, I used to have this issue where sometimes men would talk over me and then take my idea and say it was their own. This is a gender thing that happens sometimes. It was, you know, no slight, I mean, you know, no, I wasn't really, but it used to annoy me, I would like to say. And so as I got older, how I dealt with that was different than how I dealt with it when I was younger, because it was a trigger, right? It was something that got under my skin. So I had to realize that, because often it prevented me from then actually doing some other work, right? And so I had to also understand, what are the things that I needed to know things about myself. And I always say, if you're going to create places of belonging, you do have to know yourself, because you also have to think about your blind spots, which means you need a good feedback loop, because you actually can't get the feedback yourself. You can try. You can write pros and cons about yourself on a piece of paper, but it's kind of your pros and cons, right? So
Still in here.
Additional input. So, I try to keep a couple naysayers around. I try to keep, the bulk of the people are definitely, pro Lisa, but I try to keep a couple of the naysayers around so that I can get some of that feedback. I know I'm being a little facetious here, but seriously, right? And I always say this, the other thing is, I never waste a protest. I've been protested a lot. I've been the result of protests, meaning my roles, but I've also been protested a lot. You know about this. And so never waste a good protest. Use it as an opportunity to learn, to create sites of belonging, etc. Right. And I wait till so you can't do that right away sometimes, especially as people are yelling at you and telling you, you are the devil. That is very hard. You have to wait until that moment has passed. But then you can start to think about what are some of those issues. And that's where I say using some of that dissension sometimes can be really useful.
Dissension leads to growth. Dissension leads to innovation. Collaboration leads to growth. Collaboration leads to innovation. Dissension that is only dissension and it just stops, it actually leads to stasis. It doesn't lead to change either.
So and if you go back to what you were saying, I'd like to hear more about, because, one of the things that I think about the creative process in terms of like the literary process where you started, right?
Yeah.
That is a process where you have to take in a lot. People don't know that sometimes. Like writing means you have to take in a lot to curate a story. And so talk to us a little bit about you, right? And the work that you've done to curate belonging, right? As a person who comes from English in those areas. Yeah.
Yes. So that was going to be my next question, is who we be in terms of belonging.
No, I flipped it on you. I'm sorry.
No, that's perfect. The book I'm working on is about being. It is about Black being. So when I'm talking with my editor, she always say this is about who we be, how we be, right? How being happens. So I am a child of a Nigerian man and Jamaican woman who met in Madison, Wisconsin for graduate school.
That's fun.
So that's how my life started. And I was born in Jamaica, but grew up in between New Jersey and Jamaica. So that is already there, with an auntie in England, with a godmother in Panama, with my grandfather telling me, oh, our ancestry is from Haiti. Right, all of it. And then going back and forth, spending summers in the United States, in New Jersey, in Flemington, New Jersey, and spending school years in Jamaica. So for me, the thing that is different is fixity. The idea of fixity, of being able to have a single identity. For me, belonging is actually a dream. It's never something that I've been able to have access to, right? So even as a child, not being a citizen, right? Being in between Jamaica and the United States, I still have my Jamaican passport, but you're not allowed to, use in the US, you have to choose one. So for me, belonging is something I'm always curious about. And so that's why all my academic work really has been about, how do human beings create belonging? So I've written about kind of 19th century Black people of African descent in the US, Cuba, and the British West Indies in the wake of the Haitian Revolution, trying to figure out their relationship to each other, even as each country and colonial framework had a different definition of citizenship. So for one writer, it is, oh, I need to be only my national identity. I'm not race. I was a mulatto among the Blacks, he said. Right. There's another who kind of differentiates himself from the Haitians and says, no, y'all are that. I am the good citizen. I'm not like them. So that is kind of one setting, one situation. The others I've done interviews with people of African descent in Panama, in the US South, in the North, all over in Brazil, fascinated by how we situate ourselves, right? And how we find places to be, even when there are structures that try to destroy not only our being, but our ability and right to be.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's it's funny. I grew up in Toni Morrison's state. I grew up in Ohio.
Ohio.
I'm a border girl, right? So when people talk about borders, I know a lot about that. So, and people don't know this, Ohio is a border state, right? From the south to the north, but it's also the state that studied the most for political outside of Florida, because the Cincinnati votes like the South. Columbus area in the middle votes like the middle of the country. And then where I'm from, up north, they vote like the north part. And my family's from, my mom is from New York. I can still do her Bronx accent on cue. And then flip to a Brooklyn accent, because that's who she is.
It's different.
It's different, which she has that slight ability to do. I still can't do it. My mother's in her 80s, and she'll just break out any minute. My mother was a computer scientist, an accountant turned computer scientist. And so I think that I was very fortunate in a lot of ways. I was raised by a group of women who were very relatively successful given the constraints of gender and race. And that's not to say that my father was a great man. He died when I was younger. He was a businessman, et cetera. So I'm not trying to exclude him or my brother. I'm just talking about that matrilineal line. And the reason I bring that up is, in some ways, the things that you talked about, particularly in your writing. When I first was in graduate school, one of the things that I really wanted to understand, and what I did worked on my dissertation, was on psychoanalysis and race, because I wanted to understand a notion of belonging and the system, right? How that's constituted through nation and through how psychoanalysis and psychology, right, has been embedded, right, into certain kinds of areas, and what those psychological and psychiatric principles, particularly around race, when we think about Austria, Australia, and the United States, and the migration of particular psychoanalysis. But one of the things that I continue to be interested in here, and this goes back to some of the research in diversity, equity, and inclusion work, right? So we think about Claude Steele or Mahzarin Banaji, and all of their work, right, which is foregrounded very much in thinking about these ideas of exclusion and inclusion, right, which is all about belonging. And to be honest, when I think about it, so many of them are social psychologists, as you know, right? So their work is coming from deeply also wanting to understand what you talked about, belonging, right? From this sort of somewhat sociology, but also psychological, right, perspectives. And so I am continue to be not only interested and fascinated by that work, but also by how we can reimagine, right, psychological, socioeconomic, socio-political, right, context to reimagine, as you said, imagine belonging and what belonging would look like. Because I actually think for many of us, it is a fantasy. We've never actually seen it in practice. And if we have, it hasn't been sustained, right? So if we've seen it, it's often been episodic, right? And so in that way, how do we think about sustainability, intentionality, right, in these efforts of belonging? And so I think that one of the things that we don't talk enough about is that relationship between reflexivity and intentionality, right? So how are we reflexive is one thing, but then how are you intentional post those reflections? Dolly Chug's work is great work to me because it's all about that idea of, I'm actually in conversation with her tomorrow, and it's about those of you who don't know her work, Dolly Chugh wrote a book, which is, I'm going to mess up the whole title, but it's something like the hidden, the person you mean to be. It's the person you mean to be. And it's it's the person you mean to be, the hidden biases or something like that. And it's really about this concept of good intentions and goodish. So what Chugh in a nutshell argues is, and this is true of all of us, is that we imagine ourselves better than who we are, right? We imagine ourselves as super great. I'm super great. I'm a super great gardener. I'm a super great student, right? And so, or even if we think we're not great, we still think we're a little bit better than we probably are in many ways often. And so one of the examples is something like this. If you are, let's say I have a backpack on and I'm on the subway, right? I'm in New York City, so I'm in the subway and I have that big backpack on. And I turn because I'm talking to you on the subway, and then I hit somebody and they fall down, right? Because my backpack's so big and I knock them down. That's unintentional harm, right? I didn't mean to knock the person down, but the person fell, and when they fell, they hit their head on the sidebar, right? So they still got harmed, right? So my intention did not match what happened. And so what Chugh talks about, right, our intentions sometimes don't match what happens. And so that reflexivity and that intentionality, those two don't always match, right, line up. And that's where I think when I talk about being reflexive and knowing what your triggers are, et cetera, then we also have to think about in our actions, how are we being intentional and bringing that, creating pathways for people to be full citizens, right? Creating pathways for dissension to exist, and then helping to bring that back to sites of consensus. And so anyway, that I think about those kinds of things a lot.
No, that makes sense. In relation to that, can we think about allyship in terms of what you were just describing, right? Because I can want to be an ally, right? And I want to do it, but not necessarily what they want, or that not necessarily what they need. So how do
Exactly.
how do you see that in relation to what you just said?
Right. And so this is this new phrase that, and actually I can't remember who said it to me. So I didn't make it up myself. And it's do unto others, right? It's do unto others as you would have, I don't even know what the phrase is because I'm bad with cliches, but I remember the reimagining of it, which is do unto others as they would do unto themselves. But to get there, you have to have empathy, which means you have to listen. One of the things I love about design thinking, which I actually think can lead to places of belonging, because design thinking is it embeds in it the idea of making mistakes and pivot and recovery, right? But it starts with empathy. Like to do design thinking, to do that, you have to start with listening. And when we look at some of the best leaders across the world right now, Taiwan, New Zealand, Denmark, they all are women too. So I just put that out there. Anyway, that's just a shameless plug. But the other thing is, right, what have they done? They've all started with empathy, right? And this idea of radical, or in just in this case, the science of empathy, right? And operationalizing that to create, which is about, if you think about what Jacinda Ardern did post the gun crisis, right? The shootings, right? She went out and listened. She heard what those communities had to say, and then came back and held those vigils, right, for the world to see. And so I think that's the kind of, right, to operationalize belonging means you have to look at and operationalize the science of empathy in a model that allows, right, that curation, that pivot, and also, right, the ministry of possibilities, recovery, and resilience.
It can only happen if all of that is in place. I mean, I was thinking about, as I've kind of been thinking about, okay, what is possible, not only what is possible at Sarah Lawrence, but what are we ready to do, right? What are we in a groove to do?
Yes.
And I was thinking about empathy, introspection, and epistemic justice, right? Yeah. Those are the three, and they're all very related to belonging actualized, as you talk about it in your article, right? None of them can exist on their own, right? So empathy, you have to listen, which is what I'm, you're doing listening sessions, partnering with people, but then you have to, introspect, look into yourself, encourage others. So we as a community, we as individuals in community need to be willing to look into ourselves and not just say, you're the bad person, you're the bad person, you're the bad person, right? But both directions. And then epistemic justice, because if we're just, in relation to what you're saying, belonging can be just this feel good thing. Oh, we belong. I made you belong because look, I have a black Barbie, right? That is not the answer. What knowledge, what perspective is being integrated into our thinking, right? As we're building new things, are we truly kind of bringing all the knowledges to bear?
That's exactly right? We think about universal design or things like that, where we design differently so that more people have access, right? So that everyone, the threshold is not so that you have to figure out how to get access, right? That we design it from the very beginning so that everyone has access. And that is exactly about those principles that you've just outlined, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because if we don't have introspection and we don't have an emphasis on equity and justice, then, right, that's where we don't design. I was in a wheelchair for 4.5 years. And I am a person who was an athlete. Okay. And so I've had multiple knee surgeries. But one of the things that happened when I was in that wheelchair is I realized how people treat people with disabilities. I didn't know. I had never had a disability. Right. And I knew that people with disabilities were discriminated against. My gosh, I'm a diversity officer. Mm-hmm. But I'm saying, like, I didn't know the everydayness of that. Right. The strange looks. People would talk to me really loudly as if I were deaf. Right. But I was in a wheelchair, and they would start screaming at me, or they would talk to the person who was with me and never address me. There were all these odd things that I was like, what is going on? Right. But I'm just saying that because it allowed me that introspection that you're talking about, which I didn't have. But to go back to the first point is listening. So I think that we have to listen to people who are different than ourselves and really listen, right? Because I know, and I'll give you another example. I didn't know that people didn't like change. Yeah, I was like 40 something when I figured that out. It was really, really old, like really old. And I was sitting in a meeting with some HR people and this HR vice president, and she started talking about 80% of people didn't like change. And my face was like, literally in the meeting, I was like, because I was like, who knew this? Like, did other people know? And I was like, yes, they knew, because they don't like change. Right? They know, right? And I was like this. And then she went through this whole thing, and like only 4% of people or something like change. And I was like, I'm in another minority group. This is absolutely absurd. Absolutely absurd. And so, right. But it was so insightful, because it actually helped me then realize, the rapid pace of change. Yes. I love acceleration. And I was like, why do other people, why they're not accelerating, right? So I was like, yes, because I have to listen to people who are different, who work at different paces, right? I talk fast. I'm a true New Yorker. I'm my mother's child through and through, right? Talk so fast. Sometimes I talk so fast I leave words out, right? So right. And so in that way, I have to listen and think about creating a team. And one of the things that I try to do, so I'd love to hear about, especially because you're just coming into Sarah Lawrence, about creating a team. I use those tests like Myers-Briggs and the colors tests and all of those, because I always say, if I'm in this quadrant, I want my team to be in all the other quadrants, right? So tell us a little bit about how you're building your team or thinking about that, next steps.
Yeah, so one of the things that's exciting about the way Sarah Lawrence functions is by its committees. Yeah. And what's distinctive for me, committees that do things, that committees that meet, so big up Sarah Lawrence, committees
that's
that
right. Cheers to that.
Yeah, that we meet every week, right? And there's something to be done, something to do. every week, and then minutes are posted, right? So we kind of sit and decide what is our vision for the year, and at every meeting, right, there are multiple voices that contribute to that doing, right, to the planning for what we are going to do.
Committees that actually work. I think that there's
Yes.
a paper in that, and it definitely can be published for best practices across higher education.
So my committee colleagues, you hear this?
Seriously, as a person who sat on a few committees, and I won't say which institutions where, but yeah.
Yeah, but that's what's exciting. So we have the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. These are the ones that I'm on. The General Committee, Planning and Priorities Committee, and then the committees of the Board of Trust. So for me, I'm not so much imagining me building a team, a staff team, but the whole kind of campus being my colleagues and collaborators in this undertaking, and just figuring out who wants to work with me on what piece, right?
Yeah, the embedded nature of it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And or who is already moving forward on a piece, on a particular piece of the diversity, equity, inclusion pie, that I can help move forward, right? So as we are thinking about it is, to me, Sarah Lawrence has such a great potential to move forward faster than many other institutions, because of that approach, that each person or each committee can move something forward a little bit and then partner with the other committee to move it forward faster, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Can kind of build forward. So for me, the things that are important and that I love are candor. Candor is so crucial, but yet so rare in general. But I find it, I have found it here, and I encourage colleagues, let's do this. Let's have conversations that are candid. What's the situation? What's up? And let's figure out a path forward. Just saying what's up and, just say this is all bad doesn't really necessarily help. Let's kind of get it all out, say how I'm feeling. You just seem kind of strange. Why did you say that in response to this? Here is how we can move forward. Here is how we can build the future of Sarah Lawrence. And on that, here's how we can help higher education have a model, right? Liberal arts colleges have a model for the future. And so that's how I'm thinking about a team. For me, kind of everybody, including, I went to Yonkers for the first time yesterday.
Fun.
The Yonkers community as well. We had an event there. I know Kishana Soljora and the others were doing some kind of oral history engagement and collaboration there. So we're all my team.
Well, I love that because, one of the other things I talk about a lot is we've moved out of this, if you think about industrial revolution to the information revolution, and now we're in the collaboration revolution. So to your point, right, underscoring those ideas of collaboration across committees, et cetera, I think that you're right, an accelerated pace, which I like, I've already said. So yeah, that's terrific. And the other thing is, I say it's funny because I was thinking as Crystal read the bios, I've worked at these institutions. So I've worked at Tufts, I worked at Harvard, and I work now at NYU. I mean, I've worked at other institutions, but the way I like to describe that is I've worked for a giraffe, a bear, and a panther. Tufts is the giraffe, Harvard's the bear, NYU is the panther. And so as you were talking, I can tell, and it's about the way they're organizationally structured, right? Tufts is especially when I was there, an aspirational institution, right? Sitting down the street from Harvard and MIT and UMass, et cetera, right? Harvard is a bear. I think that's pretty self-explanatory, but in case you don't know that. And then of course, NYU is a panther. It's sleek, it's fast, like New York City. And if you go to sleep, it might take over your neighborhood, right? So I think, hey, right? So I think about these, but it was interesting as you were talking about the culture of Sarah Lawrence, right? And so as I think about institutions, I'm always thinking about that culture, because to create belonging or to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion, it has to be part of and embedded in the culture. So the way that you're like, I know at NYU that I had to really think about these global sites, for instance, and the fast nature, right? I said the word belonging. No one had really used it. And I walked past a window on Broadway and they had put the word belonging across the window, right? So I was like, oh, wait. But that's the culture here, right? And so I liked how you were talking about the culture of collaboration, the culture of committee, et cetera, because it sounds like you're really getting to know the culture of Sarah Lawrence, and then to advance any belonging efforts. The other thing I like to say is you actually have to know the specific organizational culture too, because it's not just like right in a vacuum. It's also attached to the people, the policies, the programs, and the resources of a given institution.
The folks are going to get an opportunity to delve into your article at the end here, but I wanted to ask you, what do you see as how is belonging key to this job? The Chief Diversity Officer job. What are the opportunities and challenges around that?
Yeah, Larry Bacow, who's the president of Harvard now, he was the president of Tufts when I was there. And one of the things that he said in a very early meeting with me, which I was brand new. I had just been appointed to the role. And I would say reluctantly, quite frankly, Larry would say that too. He kept talking to me about it. I was like, what is this role? So I was appointed. And so we were sitting there, and we were talking about a number of things. And one of the things that he said to me was, the Chief Diversity Officer role has an expansive nature, like my role. That was the first time anyone had ever said that to me, right? And here I sit with and Larry had already been the vice chancellor at MIT, et cetera. So as he said this, I was like, are we colleagues in the same area? And I was like, because I had just been a professor 5 minutes ago. So I was like, wait a second, the president is talking about us as the same. But as I've gone through this role right now, I've had a couple different roles. What I understood him to be saying is we have to think about the multiple areas across the institution: alumni development, student development, faculty development, right? The ways in which faculty are operating with students in the classroom. We have to think about HR and the hires that are happening, right? We have to work with OGC and the legal components, right? And some people don't even know that universities have a general counsel, right? So all of those, and I don't know about you, but sometimes I have to attend those meetings on facilities because I got to talk to them about disability. I don't know anything about that. The first time I went to a construction meeting, I was like, ooh, I'm going to have to read a lot more, right? And so, but I say that to say that when I think about belonging in the Chief Diversity Officer role, you have to think about all of those areas, because that's the fabric of the institution. And that's what creates belonging. And it's across all of those areas. It's the faculty area, the student area, the alumni area, the HR area, the staff, administrators, if you have union, whatever that is, right? And so we have to think about how all those communities, right? And in higher education, we don't just have managers,
right?
And, right? We have some things going on, right? Some different constituents. And so we have to think about how all those constituents are working together. And that is very much about belonging. And it's also about diversity. And I don't mean just diversity in terms of race, gender, right, sexuality. It's about diversity of experience, thought, being, etc., right? Which maps on to, obviously, we know identity, etc. But that's where I think belonging is really, that's the key, right? Is to think about how are we working and living and breathing in community together in a sustained way, because we want our institution to be sustained. So that means how are we engaging our alums? And then how are we bringing that difference in and embracing it with intentional curation that doesn't mute or blot out difference, right? But allows it to thrive and flourish in a way that will make our organizations better and stronger.
Yeah, thank you so much. This has been great. So now I turn it over. Yeah, now I turn it over to one of my official team members, Amada Sandoval, Dean of Engagement, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion.
Classic Zoom move.
Yes, yes. It's all right.
This is a chance for people to ask questions. Please write them in the chat and we'll start to address them. So I'll start. Earlier, Lisa, if I may, you had said that you never like to waste a good protest.
And of course, that.
Yeah, we do have our share of those at Sarah Lawrence. But what really interested me was how you said that you can use, you try to use a protest to create sites of belonging.
Mhm.
And I wonder if you can be specific about a time when that happened and how we might do that.
Absolutely. So one of the things that will sometimes happen is student groups will fight with one another. I don't know if you all have ever experienced this, but occasionally that happens. Student groups don't agree and they go at it. And so recently, well, not this year, but this was pre-COVID, but we had a student group go after another student group in our newspaper, and it became very public. And it's like that sort of crabs in the barrel phenomenon, right? Everybody's trying to tear each other down. And so then what we did was we started to meet with these groups, okay? And of course they were like, we will not talk to the other group. We will not meet with them. They are the blah, 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 blah. Horrible, horrible, horrible. And like I said, now this fight is all, we were in the news. There was a little article. It was bad. It was bad. And so we started a very long process of meeting with these student groups individually. And then what we did was we started to meet with other student groups. So not just the two student groups that were fighting, but the student groups who had also been impacted by this fight.
Mm.
And what we did was then bring some of those student leaders who had been impacted by the fight to the separate groups. So now they're not talking with the people they've been in a fight with per se, but they're talking with people who have been impacted by some of this bad behavior, right? And so through that series of conversations, then eventually we were able to bring those two groups together, right? To say, this impact, right, is greater than just you two. And so we have to think about community engagement, best practices, the values that we have as a community, right? Which then allowed us to then develop a new program that we have called Not So Difficult Dialogues.
Mm-hmm.
So difficult dialogues,
I like that.
not so difficult, right? And we're bringing in facilitators and all kinds of things. In fact, at Denison, and you all can look this up, Denison's doing some great work. They just started a new debate society, right? But the debate society that they've started is focused on it's called the Contemporary Debate Club or something. I don't know. It's got some cute little name, right? But they've just started this, and that what they're doing is bringing those controversial topics to the fore, not waiting for them, right, to sort of emerge. And so I would say that's the second piece, Amada, is also walking into the fire.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right. Sometimes I just walked in. Like if we're gonna fight about, let's say we're gonna fight about, we have a campus in Israel and we have a campus in Abu Dhabi. We're gonna fight about those campuses. Then let's schedule a conference and we have part of it in Israel,
Let's just do
part
it.
of it in Abu Dhabi, right? And then we're going to bring the rabbis, we're going to bring right? And we started a new faith center in Abu Dhabi as a result of this, right?
Oh, yeah.
So those are the kinds of things, right, that I think you one, organizationally seeds those conversations. But it's not easy. And I won't pretend that it is. And it's usually, but that's why I said I don't waste the moment. So we did this, and then we used it to create Not So Difficult Dialogues, right? We used this conference to then create more conversation about interfaith across. And now we're working with the Abu Dhabi government through NYU and our Hillel Center, et cetera, to create some new things.
Yeah.
Similarly, we just did a partnership with Zoom. The reason you're able to put your pronouns into Zoom is because we just did that. We just did a partnership with them, right? And so we were like, at NYU, we were like, well, we helped them with closed captioning first because we're big. So by the way, for people out there, we're huge. So when I'm saying this, like Sarah Lawrence, we're just huge by comparison. So these partnerships, some of these were already in the works and then we extended them. I just want to say that because like, I don't want people to think like, right, we're just massive. So in that way though, but what has that helped us to do? It helped us when we were being critiqued by people with disabilities internal to our organization. Right. I was able to say, okay, you're right. You're right. We don't have it together. We pivoted to online and COVID. We don't have it together. Admit your mistake. We were wrong. We didn't know what we were doing and we didn't think about it. Then we partnered with Zoom. We got the closed captions. We got them to really think about it. And then we partnered on this other thing around the pronouns, right? That's what I mean about, right, using the moment.
Right. Well, I think one of the things that's brilliant about that, and it echoes the restorative justice, right? It's that when you see how your actions have an impact on people that you weren't even necessarily in direct dialogue with, right? That's kind of an opportunity to be welcomed back into the sense of a whole community.
That's right. And that's exactly right around the restorative justice. We have a professor, Niobe Way, and she teaches here at NYU. She teaches in our Abu Dhabi campus as well as our New York campus, one semester each. And part of what she did was she developed this program with students where where she does these what she calls radical interviewing.
Yes.
And right, you know what I'm talking about, right? And so you have to sit there and interview the other person and listen. And you just have to interview and listen. You can't interrupt. You can't give your own thoughts. You can't, right? And it's often, she situates the conversations with people who have very different ideas, right, about something. And so then you have to sit and listen. It's like that old debate club where you put people on the side. I'm old. I remember we were on the other side of the room. You had to listen to the one side and listen to the other side, right? But she's done that process. And what it's allowed for our students, especially those students who are often in deep disagreement, it has closed some of those gaps.
So, I mean, that is the thing about it, right? Is that you can, it is possible. So I have a question for you, Amada. I don't know if there are any more that you've gotten.
Yeah, I have. Yeah, there's one in the chat. Should I?
Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
So this is directed toward Lisa, and it's wondering what you see as Sarah Lawrence's unique work, given our history as a,
and then outside Sarah Lawrence, so that's great.
Yeah, but a considerably smaller and historically and predominantly white institution. What's our unique work in the forms in terms of anti-racism and self-awareness, collective responsibility?
Oh, that's great. I think that so let me first say, as a liberal arts institution, I think that the work is very much about, as we were talking before, about that learning cycle and process of learning that's very deep and embedded. I love liberal arts institutions because I actually think, this is being recorded, I love my institution too. But what I would say is, I love my institution, but larger institutions have a tendency, right, to blanket things, right? We don't always have that intimacy in the way that you would have in a liberal arts institution, because some of our focus isn't liberal arts sometimes. It could be business or medicine or whatever. So I want to say that. And so as a result, I actually think that deep work that was talked about earlier in the collaboration across your committees, to go back to that, you can accelerate this work in ways that actually, I think, large, unwieldy organizations like the Harvards, the Princetons, et cetera, can't do. It's not because they don't, it's not about will. That's not what I'm suggesting. Maybe some of it is will, but it's also just about organizational structures, right? And you have a structure that lends itself to that. The second I would say is, yes, okay, so you're a predominantly historically white institution. So are most institutions, actually, in the United States, as it turns out. Those who have had, success, etc. It takes Spelman and Morehouse out, but other than that, right? And so I actually think that what predominantly white institutions have to offer, and I think a lot about my alma mater, Denison, is when we looked at those protests that happened during COVID for 40 consecutive days globally, that wasn't Black people. That wasn't Latinx people. Those were the most multicultural, and I use that word in sort of multi-ethnic, multi-dynamic groups that we've seen in terms of protest and hit ever, right? They were more diverse than the 60s. First of all, we're more diverse as a country than we were in the 60s in terms of the number of people and different types of people. So that lends itself to that. But that tells me something, right, about where we are as a nation and as a globe. And what I think is, by the way, I'm a little optimistic sometimes. I can be pessimistic. And so I think that the backlash that we've been seeing, the pushback, some of it is political, some of it is toward educators, right? We've seen some of that pushback toward education and educators. And a lot of that, I think, is because it's a pendulum, right? If you study the long arc of history, what is we have pendulum swings. And anytime things are moving forward, like the 60s or the 20s or the 1880s, there's a swing, there's a push back, right? And so that's what we're experiencing, to be sure. But the will of globally, what those protests and what all of those things have demonstrated to me is that when we talk about good intentions, like Dahlia Chug's book, right? Most people don't want to annihilate other people. Now, there are some. Hopefully they're not at Sarah Lawrence, most of them. But right, for the most part, that is not what people want to do. And so what we have to do, I always say this, right? 10% of people are just good and going to do the right thing. 80% of people are in the middle. And you have 10% of people who are just bad. Don't worry about those 10% that are bad. But that 80%, right? We've got to work with them because sometimes they don't have the information. Sometimes they don't have things, they don't know things, their experiences have been limited, whatever those things are, right? And so how do we work with that 80% to make substantive change? And that is that predominantly white institution. And we have to give tools, information, allow people to make mistakes, recover, and be resilient, because that is how institutions move forward.
There it is. Thank you so much, Lisa. My colleagues at Sarah Lawrence and I thank you. And I say to my colleagues at Sarah Lawrence, we ready? Well,
I look forward to seeing all the wonderful things that you are going to do and being in conversation with you after this. And I'm just so thankful that congratulations to Sarah Lawrence for bringing you on board. Congratulations to you, Crystal. And I anytime we can partner together, I'll be looking forward to that.
All right, let's do it. You hear this, my Sarah Lawrence colleagues? Let's do this. All right, Crystal, thank you.
So Lisa, Ifeoma, thank you both. Thank you to everybody for being with us. Thank you, Lisa, for helping introduce Ifeoma to our community and for that partnership that we have. And we have lots more to come on belonging, lots of conversations, listening, and we're just excited to do that work. And thanks, everybody. And Ifeoma, you are officially launched at Sarah Lawrence, and we look forward to everything that you, with all of us, you're going to lead us into. So partnership. Thank you, everybody. Partnership, collaboration. And thank you both for your liveliness, your optimism, your also hard truths, and the way that you have provoked us with things we'll continue to think about long beyond this moment tonight. Thank you.
All right.
Thank
Good night,
you,
everyone.
Bye.
It was so great. Thank you. I'll be in touch.
We'll talk.
Okay.
Have a great night.
Have a great night. Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.